Barakata Yahweh, Barakata Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakah Kodash, Barakata. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, glory, and infinite honors to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, double honors to the apostles and elders, a great millstone that rule well, and peace and salutations to Ya'akim out there pushing this word in truth and sincerity. May you brothers endure until the end. This is the brother Raya with another video, and I got a few articles and scriptures to show that America's allies, his chief allies, are beginning to turn against it and starting to find ways to circumvent the dominance of the U.S. dollar. And this is all going to culminate in the U.S.'s allies turning against the U.S. and allying themselves with the adversaries of the U.S. to shoot their nuclear missiles onto the United States, which is Babylon the Great, and turn it into that biblical lake of fire. And the first article I'll be using is on ZeroHedge.com, and the title reads, Europe is working on alternative to SWIFT for financial independence from the U.S. In the aftermath of a report that Germany was working on a global payment system that is independent of the U.S. and SWIFT, on Monday, Germany and France said they're working on financing solutions to sidestep U.S. sanctions against countries such as Iran, including a possible role for central banks. With Germany, we are determined to work on an independent European or Franco-German financing tool which would allow us to avoid being the collateral victims of U.S. extraterritorial sanctions, French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire said Monday during a meeting with Press Association AJEF. I want Europe to be a sovereign continent, not a vassal, and that means having total independent financing instruments that do not today exist. And this brings me to my first precept in Obadiah. I'm going to start at verse 7. All the men of thy confederacy or thy allies have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee, such as France and Germany, have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. They that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee. There is none understanding in him. As we just said, we're seeing this happen right now with U.S. allies such as France and Germany looking for ways to circumvent the control of the U.S. dollar so they can do deals with countries that the U.S. has a problem with. And again, that's all going to culminate with these allies of the U.S. Laying a wound under the U.S. by shooting their nuclear missiles onto the U.S. and turning it into that lake of fire. The discussions, which also involve the UK, are a signal that European powers are trying to get serious about demonstrating a greater level of independence from the US as President Donald Trump pursues his America First agenda. And that's all part of prophecy too, that the UK is involved in these talks because the UK is the mother of the United States. And this brings me to Jeremiah 50 verse 11. Because ye were glad, because ye rejoiced, O ye destroyers of mine heritage, because ye are grown fat as the heifer at grass, and bellow as bulls. And this is speaking of Babylon or the United States, which have been the destroyers of the heritage of the Most High, which are you so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, the true children of Israel, because not just in the past, but all the way up until today, we're still under subjection to you American Edomites, and you're killing our people in the streets and putting us in jail and doing whatever you can to make sure our communities flounder in this society. That's all coming to an end very shortly. Verse 12, your mother shall be sore confounded, she that bare you shall be ashamed. And that mother is speaking of the United Kingdom, which the United States came out of. So it's the mother of the United States. And by her being ashamed, she'll turn against the U.S. and again shoot those nuclear missiles onto the U.S. Behold, the hindermost of the nations shall be a wilderness, a dry land, and a desert after these nuclear missiles hit the United States, turning it into that lake of fire, and then eventually that wilderness, that dry land, that desert that will only be inhabited by desert creatures and no humans. Verse 13, because of the wrath of Yahweh it shall not be inhabited, but it shall be wholly desolate. Every one that goeth by Babylon or the United States shall be astonished, and hiss at all her plagues, because these nations are going to look on the ruins of America and see that that's the judgment for a nation that's ruled the world wickedly. That's all America's legacy is going to be. And I've pretty much gotten to the point of my first article, and now I'm going to go to my second article on Asia Times, and the title reads, Putin's wedding trip seals marriage of convenience with Merkel. Meeting in Berlin could signal a switch in strategy for Germany when it comes to the US dollar and energy security. All the men of thy confederacy, I don't want to paraphrase it, all the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee. It was supposed to be a low-key, traditional Austrian wedding until Vladimir Putin pulled up in a black limo. The bride was Austrian Foreign Minister Karen Niesel, a top energy analyst and former professor at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna and the European Business School in Frankfurt. She knows all there is to know about multiple aspects of Eurasia integration, which is close to the Russian president's heart. So close, in fact, that he stole the show by arriving in a convoy bearing lavish flowers and the Kuban Cossack choir. After a swirl on the dance floor with the blonde-haired but not blushing bride, he dashed off to Germany for the real business. This was a 3-hour, multi-themed face-to-face meeting north of Berlin with Chancellor Angela Merkel. There was no translators, as both are fluent in Russian and German, as I pointed out in Asia Times, but it was Russian analyst Rostislav Ishenko in a text featuring a Pushkin analogy and beautifully translated into English, who unlocked these chains of events. And that brings us to German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, who wrote in the business paper Handelsblatt about the idea of a European Union payment system bypassing the US dollar and ultimately the Iran sanctions. And all this is just paths which are leading to the mandatory implementation of the mark of the beast, which is that RFID microchip. An alternative system is exactly what the BRICS, namely Brazil, Russia, of course, India, China, and South Africa, as well as the China-Russia-Iran triumvirate, have been discussing and slowly implementing for years. Now let us see if we can decode this brand new EU-wide controversy from 3 different angles. First up is an aristocratic German financier, now based in Switzerland, who insisted on anonymity. He stressed, too many European and Swiss financial institutions and regulators are run by Americans, and they are extremely afraid of the American rhetoric of locking them out of Wall Street if they misbehave, because America is that part of the fourth beast whose look was more stout than his fellows, as it says in Jeremiah chapter 7, I'm going to start at verse 19. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, and his nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. And that fourth beast is that reincarnated Roman Empire, that NATO-EU alliance, which has just been running roughshod over the world and just turning it into a wilderness. Verse 20, and of the 10 horns that were in his head, which is speaking of the EU, and of the other which came up, that little horn, which is the United States, and before whom 3 fell, which is speaking of Britain, France, and Spain, which the U.S. has had wars with in the past, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things, those great things being the blasphemies against the Most High, such as pushing for transgenderism and homosexuality, feminism, destroying the environment, and madness like that. Just that Aleister Crowley do as thou wilt spirit, whose look was more stout than his fellows. And as we just read from that article, I want to say, too many European and Swiss financial institutions and regulators are run by Americans, and they are extremely afraid of the American rhetoric of locking them out of Wall Street if they misbehave, whose look was more stout than his fellows. But wait, there's a snag. Since the days of the Treaty of Rome, just further going to show that this fourth beast is that reincarnated Roman Empire, the EU has struggled to agree on even a single important decision related to money, banking, taxes, subsidies, you name it, he continued. Moreover, the trust by other nations in an EU leadership is even lower than the feared yet customarily obeyed US global leadership. And even if they could have a vague attempt at such a large-scale revolution before the croissants are eaten, New York currency traders would have nuked the euro before Brussels had finished its after-lunch siesta, he added. And again, that's not only because America is that horn whose look was more stout than his fellows, but a lot of these EU nations are the partly weak part made of clay of the reincarnated Roman Empire. This brings me to Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 2. I'm going to start at verse 33. And this is speaking of that statue that Daniel saw in that vision, which is speaking of the past kingdoms. Verse 33, his legs of iron, speaking of the ancient Roman Empire, his feet part of iron and part of clay, that reincarnated Roman Empire. Now I'm going to jump down to verse 40. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. And that's again speaking of that reincarnated Roman Empire, that NATO-EU alliance, which is definitely subdued all things, because who's in the rulership right now? The United States and Europe. Verse 41, and whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of the potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And those toes, part of iron, is speaking of NATO, while the partly clay, the weak part, is the EU. And the chief head of NATO right now is the U.S., whose look is more stout than his fellows, and who is more stronger than the partly broken part. So that's why the U.S. is able to dictate its rules unto the European Edomites. But as we're reading, they're trying to find ways to circumvent U.S. leadership and that U.S. dollar, which again is all going to culminate in them turning against the U.S. and shooting their nuclear missiles onto the U.S. Not exactly an EU independence manifesto. As for future prospects for the Union, the financier warned, in the economy of the future, Europe will be an also-ran. On a 5 to 10 year horizon, I see Chinese monetary dominance as inevitable. Forget Europe. And the Chinese, which are the Moabites, think that they've got next after the U.S. collapses, but that honor belongs to the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans who are the true children of Israel. And you got to remember, China's pushing hard to become that next power. They recently launched that Petro Yuan, but that's not going to matter, because all these different means to circumvent the U.S. dollar and eventually lead to its collapse are all part of the path leading towards the mark of the beast, which is that RFID microchip, the ultimate tool that the elites want to use to rule the planet and everybody on it. What the German elite really thinks, now compare it with a sharp, shorter-term view by German politico-economic analyst Peter Spengler. He correctly argues that SWIFT, the global payment system, is not the problem. SWIFT, the world's largest cooperative payment network, operates under Belgian, that is EU law, which the US Treasury warriors plus the British GCHQ and the NSA have been breaking for more than 10 years, despite protests from the European Parliament, he said. Remember, that horn whose look was more stout than his fellows. Europe and associated countries and currencies do not need another system, but international law enforcement and the elimination of the US dollar, and hence the New York Fed, from payment transactions for real neutral and multilateral clearing. Salak. It is no secret in Brussels that the EU has been excruciatingly slow in admitting its dependence on Washington. Again, that those toes made of clay, partly weak. It will be a long and winding road towards liberation, even though it has already started, and it's not going to be a long road, because we're in the last seconds of these last days, and it's the destruction of the United States, which is Babylon the